Around 5 a.m. on October 15th, 1917, Mata Hari woke up for the last time. She would have faced a wall of officials and she would have known exactly what that meant. That her last appeals had failed and she would be executed that day by the military for the crime of treason. She put on the finest clothes that she had left in the prison, she wrote some letters that never got sent, and she refused last rites. While she was walking out to meet the crowd, she turned to a nun who had been helping her the last few days, and she joked, "All these people, what a success." She refused a blindfold, and as she faced the firing squad, some people say she blew a kiss, some people say she just stood very, very still. Either way, it's there that she met her fate. But was she guilty of treason, or was she just guilty of being in the wrong time at the wrong place, and most critically, being the wrong kind of woman? So the first that I heard of Matahari, I was in the International Spy Museum, and there was like this enormous photo of her, and she looks very glamorous. She looks beautiful, and there's this in huge letters it says like seduction or like betrayal or something like this. So of course, immediately I was intrigued. I think spies are always interesting, and if they are sexy female spies, they are even more interesting. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. There have been more than 250 biographies written about her. There have been multiple movies. And most interestingly about all of this is it's very hard to separate fact from fiction when it comes to her life. And this is partially because Mata Hari herself fed into the fiction so much. She was constantly lying about who she was and where she was from, and she wasn't particularly interested in whether or not things were true. She was more interested in whether or not they sounded cool. Um, and she had just been kind of very fanciful her whole life. There are several times throughout her life you can see she's just not living 100% in the reality that everybody else is living in. And that is also to her credit, but it is also something that she ends up possibly being punished for. Yeah, so here we go. I've talked enough about this. Mazahari was born August 7th, 1876 in the Dutch town of Leeuwarden. She was born to parents Adam and Antje Zell. Um, Both her parents were fully Dutch, and this does become important later on. She was like darker than people typically associate with Dutch people in terms of dark hair, darker skin complexion, dark eyes. And this led to rumors of her being like mixed, possibly part Indonesian, possibly part Jewish, but none of these rumors are true. She was fully Dutch. She just looked a little different. The first 10 to 13 years of her life are great. Her father is a hat shop owner and a successful one, and he has married up. Anta is part of a higher social class than he would have been. She doesn't necessarily have any wealth, but he's very happy of the kind of elevated social status he's managed to achieve. People kind of, to make fun of him, refer to him as the Baron, but he loves it. He's into it because this man is ostentatious. He gets himself painted riding on horseback, and he insists that his children have like a high level education. So from a young age, Matahari learns multiple languages, including German and French. She learns beautiful penmanship and how to play the piano and that type of thing. At this time, a former classmate of hers said that she was like an orchid in a field of dandelions. And her father spoiled her. Like, for example, like on one birthday, she got a carriage driven by goats, which honestly sounds amazing for a child or for an adult. But people thought it was a ridiculous gift because it is, but Matahari loved it. And she was used to this level of, kind of like frivolity and luxuriating in the finer things of life. However, everything goes wrong February 18th, 1889. Probably starting before then, but we know definitively February 18th, 1889, Adam the Baron goes bankrupt. And he immediately leaves to The Hague for a job, I believe, and the rest of the family is left to kind of scramble together. Margarita has three younger brothers. They're not really that important, but it's four kids, Ansha, who happens to be sick now. And the next 2 years are rough. Like at one point, Adam comes back, but the marriage is completely deteriorating, falling apart. Then, very soon after that, Anja succumbs to her illness. So, May 10th, 1891, just a little over 2 years since the bankruptcy is declared, Margarita's mother dies. One thing that is interesting about the day that Margarita's mother dies is Margarita can be heard playing the piano. on that day, which was considered very improper and inappropriate. And this is the first real example we get of Margaretha kind of doing what she feels and what she thinks is fine, kind of in the face of what all of society at the time would have thought. Because she told a friend she was simply expressing herself and all her sadness at the death of her mother. The siblings get split up. Her youngest brothers go to live with Adam and his new wife. The oldest brother gets sent to live with other relatives, and Margaretha gets sent to the Frisian town of Sneek to live with her godfather. Frisia is like one of those like old European regions, kind of like Bavaria in Germany, but Frisia just applies more to the Netherlands kind of area. Anyway, so she's in Sneek, and they kind of don't know what to do with her. She's 15 now. She's from a disgraced family. She's like 5'9" and kind of unconventional looking. And they kind of end up trying to pass her off onto the Leyden school to become a kindergarten teacher. As you can imagine, this doesn't really suit her personality at all. And she starts going by Mgreet around this time, and her friends are saying Mgreet is not the kind of character to do this. Usually, somebody should have like some kind of motherly instinct, and she's just a personality. And almost immediately, she runs into trouble at this Hanstra school in Leiden. There is a headmaster of the school, Vin Brandes. Sorry about the Dutch names, but I think his name is Vin Brandes Hanstra, and he is 51 and he is married, and allegedly he either pursues Ingrid or they actually have some kind of, in quotes, affair. Interestingly, the Hanstra school has no records for the years in which Ingrid attended, besides the fact that they can confirm that she was a student there. There's some kind of seeming of a cover up, but pretty much every biography states that she had had an affair with the headmaster, and as a result, she was expelled instead of anything necessarily happening to him. And again, as a reminder, at this time she's 16, so it was not legal. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so not only was this man 51, the headmaster of a school, married, he was also a friend of the family, and that is part of why they sent her to this school in the first place. So that just adds a whole other layer of ick to the situation. Jail for this man. She's sent to live with other relatives at The Hague. And honestly, this kind of like suits her better. She kind of likes a bigger city, and she also has a thing for officers who end up to just be in the Hague area more because it's like close to the ocean. Um, and while she's here, she is kind of looking for someone to date, looking to see someone. And who does she find but Rudolph McLeod, who was of Scottish descent but a Dutch citizen. And he just happens to be in The Hague on a health break from his time in the Dutch East Indies. So, a little bit about Rudolph. He is 20 years older than her. She is 17 at this time. Some reports say she's 18. If you do the math, she is 17 when they meet. He is 39. He is coming off participating in one of the most brutal Dutch colonial wars ever. So, this is the Aceh War that happened in the Dutch East Indies. It said between 30 and 100,000 Indonesian freedom fighters died in this war, and about 8,000 Dutchmen died in combat. But this isn't counting everybody who died from disease. And during the rainy season, disease accounted for up to 60% of deaths in this area. So it's brutal, it's awful. There's a lot of like nasty like colonial practices, especially regarding Native women and that type of thing, where rather than risk homosexuality, there is state sanctioned prostitution and keeping of Native concubines who have no rights. And this is important context because this is the world that Rudolph is coming from. He is on a health break for rheumatism and diabetes, but modern interpretations of this rheumatism and diabetes diagnosis kind of speculate that it is not that he has rheumatism and diabetes, but it is actually that he has syphilis. And so Mgreet finds this syphilitic man who is almost 40 and coming off of 20 years in a brutal military regime. and they fall in love. He puts an ad in the newspaper that says something like, "Oh, officer on leave, looking for a nice girl, object matrimony," and she sends him a letter with a photo, and he's infatuated. They are formally engaged after only 6 days knowing each other. She has to get permission from her father because she's still like under 18. This all happens, they get married, and almost immediately the marriage starts to deteriorate. He gambles, he drinks, he's cheating on her. She doesn't want to do any housework. She just wants to spend money. He doesn't have any money. They're living with in-laws. The in-laws don't like her. What ends up happening is they have a baby. So they have baby Norman on January 30th, 1897. And now he's run out of extension on his health leave and also on the leave for his wife being pregnant. And it is time for them to go back to the Dutch East Indies. So Dutch East Indies, modern day Indonesia. What we know is that she would have entered as like a high-ranking official, but her complexion and stuff would have caused some problems for her socially because she just happens to look like she might be mixed. They have a second child, May 2nd, 1898, and this child is named Louise Jean. It's a girl. They call her Non because honestly, they named her after Rudolph's sister, who Greet doesn't like, which I thought was like kind of funny. Like, why even name her after the sister? But maybe Rudolph chose it. For a while, things are kind of okay. What happens is Rudolph ends up being called to a different city, and then he cannot afford to bring his family with him. So they're separated for a time. Like tragedy ends up striking. So what happens is after Rudolph can finally bring his family to him, both Norman and Non are poisoned. And there's a couple different theories around this poisoning. Some people think that it's a disgruntled servant or an old concubine of Rudolph's who's jealous of the new family who might have poisoned them. But it's actually like more likely based on like the news coverage in the area and that type of a thing, where kind of natives killing a child of an officer would have been a very big deal. It seems more likely that they were actually medically poisoned. And the way that this would have happened is, if you remember from about 5 minutes ago, Rudolph, the treasurer that he is, had syphilis when he got married. He passed the syphilis to Ingrid, or Greta as she's going by now. So he passes the syphilis to Greta. Greta, via like congenital, like in birth, transfers the syphilis to both of their children. And when the doctor is trying to treat the children for syphilis, which involves treatment with mercury at this time period, he accidentally overdoses it and Norman dies. Non ends up surviving, but she does die suddenly at the age of 21 from an aneurysm that's also believed to be a complication from congenital syphilis. So the whole thing is like very tragic. Their bad relationship after this just gets even worse. Rudolph starts getting physically violent with Greta, and also just even in front of other people, he's like saying horrible things about her. She starts writing letters back home about how she needs to get out, how she wants to leave. Eventually, the whole family in 1902 is able to move back to the Netherlands, and at this point, she tries to divorce him. Eventually, she decides to give up on her daughter and just go live her own life and let Rudolph deal with it. And he still hasn't given her a divorce at this point. This is when Marguerite starts to live on her own in Paris. And what is a single woman going to do? How is she going to make money at this time period? She has no skills, etc. It seems that she turns to prostitution for a time. She eventually gets a job at some kind of equestrian show. This is when she starts to get the idea of becoming a dancer. Interestingly, she did have like a slight interest in Indonesian dance when she was living in the Dutch East Indies. She had written to her friends in the Netherlands and she described herself as taking on the name Matahari, which meant eye of the day or like the sun in Malay. And she doesn't quite step into using this name yet. She just calls herself Lady MacLeod, and she starts doing this Dutch or this Indonesian cultural dance, which is just her kind of, maybe there's some reference to some real Indonesian dancing that she had seen, but it's largely her making things up. And a critical element of this dance that she invents is that it's essentially a striptease where she gets naked by the end of it, but she has wrapped it all up in this kind of packaging of it being, oh, spiritually significant and cultural. So interestingly, when she debuts as Matahari, she debuts in a museum, the Musée Guimet. This is March 13th, 1905. And she has a good run. She's in the right place at the right time. It's Le Belle Epoque. Everything is sensational, and this kind of like Orientalism's like at its peak. So people find her fascinating. They're writing rave reviews. She's also not the only dancer to be kind of like tweaking the boundary a little bit. In Vienna, at one point she's in Germany, then she's in Austria and Vienna. Um, she is involved in what they call the War on Tights, where there's her, a woman named Isadora Duncan, who was notorious for dancing without a corset and without tights, and then Maud Allen, who had played Salome at one point, but Matahari regarded her as kind of like a weak imitation of her true Javanese dance, which is honestly pretty funny when you consider that Matahari's like form of like Indonesian dancing she kind of just made up. When people compare her to this other woman like Maud Allen, she like looks at her and she's like, well, she cannot have, since I was born and raised in Java, I have the true culture of the dance, I have the true understanding of the dance, and this other woman simply cannot compete with me. Which, as knowing what we know, is a ridiculous thing to say. And of course, you can definitely speculate on how like harmful that maybe bringing these stereotypes and tying it all together and profiting off of the culture that her husband definitely did a lot to harm is. But you know, I feel like there weren't necessarily these ways of thinking and thoughts and standards in the colonial powers at this time. So she's an immediate success. She's at notorious lesbian garden parties. She is performing at people's houses. She's performing at theaters. And kind of word of this gets back to Rudolph, and he's actually trying to remarry so that he, as a woman who's even younger than Matahari, of course, because he doesn't want to take care of his daughter alone. And he sees her doing all this, and he finally requests a divorce from her, citing all this immoral behavior, and he gets it. So now she's officially a unmarried woman, even though that never really stopped her before. She has tons of high profile affairs. It honestly gets exhausting to list them all, so I'm not going to. But there is a prominent like German society man. There's a French ambassador, but she has like a couple like really good years. By around like the 1910s or whatever, she starts to get like, I'll put on a little bit of weight, start to lose roles for that reason. She's no longer the same sensation that she was when she first broke onto the screen. So instead of like really making money from dancing, like most of her wealth and ability to buy fine things and that type of spending is coming from her many lovers. She's still dancing occasionally. She's regularly traveling between Germany and France. She doesn't seem to like the Netherlands all that much, but Europe is changing. If you haven't noticed, the years have been ticking up, and we're right up to the point of the start of the First World War. And when the First World War breaks out, she is in Berlin. She's a foreigner in Berlin. So critically, what happens is her furs get seized. And I know that that does not sound like a critical detail, but Matahari was very upset by this. They were very valuable furs. She did not think it was fair because what did the war have to do with her? There's nothing she can really do about it. She tries to go back to France because like half her assets are also in France, and she's denied entry because she's a citizen of a neutral country and these are at war, and it's a whole mess. So she gets back to Holland. She's living in The Hague as a mistress of a well-known man. She critically gets visited while she's in the Netherlands, since it's a neutral country, by the German consul, Karl Kramer. And he decides to propose to her to become a spy for Germany. And he upfront gives her 20,000 francs and asks her to write him letters in invisible ink. Matahari categorically objects to invisible ink. She doesn't think it's stylish, but she does take his 20,000 francs. And later, this would be used as evidence of her having agreed to become a spy for Germany. But Matahari's version of events is she simply took the 20,000 francs because she felt that the Germans owed her after taking her furs, and her furs were worth a great deal more than 20,000 francs. So, ordinarily, that would sound kind of ridiculous. Like, obviously, accepting money from a foreign government in exchange for espionage would, to most people, signal that you had intent of spying for them. But in Matahari's mind, like, it was just like, from her perspective, it was just her getting paid back. And knowing what we know of her, it's honestly not that unbelievable. So this is 1915. At one point, she tries to go to back to France because she's sick of the Netherlands. She doesn't want to be there anymore, and she's actually refused. She has to go by way of England in order to avoid some war zone, and they kind of flag her. It's not because they find any evidence. They don't know about any interaction she's had with the Germans at this time. It's just she's talking very loudly about her lovers and all of this, and they just find her to be suspicious. And unbeknownst to her, they open a file on her. And in 1916, she decides she's going to try to go to France again. She gets on a boat a different way somehow, where she doesn't have to go through England, and she gets to France. And immediately, she's being tailed by two French agents. And what she doesn't know is that in the background, what's happened is that the British have contacted the French and they've warned her about her. They've said she's a suspicious person. They've also said, if you find her, please send her to Scotland Yard. Around this time, she's met two lovers who are going to be consequential in some way to the rest of her life. One is Jean Halvard. He's a French officer. She doesn't really seem to like him that much, but she does see him several times. The other one is Vadim Maslov. And Vadim is a Russian officer who has been sent to like help the French. He comes from an aristocratic line. He's significantly younger than her, and she actually seems to fall in love with him. So one thing, honestly, that I was wondering about this whole time is, doesn't she have syphilis? Like, why is this not a problem? But I looked into it, and like, I guess on like WebMD, if I'm a professional doctor using WebMD, but it seems like for when it comes to the syphilis infection, like often it can go into kind of a latent phase where there are just like rare breakouts that you would have to treat, but the only way to really like transmit syphilis is to come into direct contact with an open sore during a breakout. So it seems like maybe she did get away with all this, philandering without necessarily infecting everybody she knew. Anyway, that was just a detail that I got caught up on and I was curious about. But back to what's going on in her life right now. She actually does like Vadim and considers it like a real relationship. She very much wants to go see Vadim on the front, right? And this would require her to go into a war zone. She needs special permission to go into a war zone. So Jean refers her to the Georges Ledoux guy who can get her into the war zone. He can sign her a permit. This guy is the head of French espionage. It is kind of like hard to figure out if he was just wildly incompetent or if he was actively trying to sabotage the French, to be honest. So he staked his entire career in France on insisting that there are just like hundreds of like foreign spies everywhere. He's the one who has a tail on Matahari. He has gotten the telegrams from the British. And so when she visits him to get her permit, he decides to try to recruit her to be a spy for France. Nowadays, when you think of a spy, you think like James Bond, glamour, and like gadgets and like sexy women and all of that. That's not how people thought of spies. Back in the day, like being a spy actually had quite a negative connotation. And that's part of why Matahari is approached to spy, is because they associated her love life with just being innately immoral and willing to betray others, betray her country, and that type of a thing. Even though her country's neutral, so I don't really know how she would betray them. She doesn't want to, though. She just wants to go to her boyfriend in the war zone. So she eventually gets the permit together. She meets Vadim. He's actually been injured by like phosphine gas, and he's like partially blind. She takes like a photo with him, and they discuss marriage. It's like serious. So when she comes back from Vittel, she gets it into her head that the best thing she can do right now is quickly make 1,000,000 francs. And what is her idea of how to make 1,000,000 francs? She'll just go spy a bit for the French, and then she'll come up with some great information and they'll give her 1,000,000 francs, and that'll be that. So she goes to Lido, and what she says happens is at this time, he tells her that she is going to go to Belgium, and it's her job in Belgium, since it's a neutral country also, to kind of find someone German, seduce them, get information from them. And so she starts trying to embark upon that journey. She has to stop in England again for this. And in Falmouth, she gets pulled aside by this guy called George Grant, who mistakes her for another exotic dancer turned spy who is named Clara Benedicts, and he believes that she is her. Um, he interrogates her a bit. They send her to prison. The British wire the French and say, "Hey, we have one of your people here. She's saying that you recruited her to spy." And immediately, Lido abandons her and says, "Oh, no, 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 that was a trap. I think she's a German spy, and I'm trying to entrap her." So obviously, this does her no favors. They arrest her, and eventually, they can't continue to hold her because there really is no evidence at this point. So they just tell her, "No, you can't go forward to Belgium. You're going to have to go back to Spain." So she ends up in Madrid. And when she gets back to Madrid, she doesn't really know what to do at first, but she doesn't have her 1,000,000 francs that she needs to marry Vadim. So she's like, well, maybe there are some Germans in Spain. Maybe I can get some information out of them that way. And, she finds some Germans in Spain. So most critically, she seduces a Major Call, and she does actually get some information out of him. He tells her about some submarines in Morocco. The Germans are aware that the French have broken one of the codes that they've been using, but she can't get in touch with Lido because, unbeknownst to her, he's already abandoned her. He's just sitting, waiting in France for her to come back and to arrest her. But she thinks she's still acting as a spy for him, and she can still get her 1,000,000 francs. So she can't get in contact with him. She ends up giving this information to somebody who is infatuated with her at the time. It's not Major Call, it's a Frenchman. The Frenchman goes back to Lido, and he kind of essentially doesn't pass on the information. He betrays her. I think probably what happened is when he got back, he realized the situation that Matahari was in and just decided to absolve himself from it and not get involved. She thinks that she's done enough and she's going to go back to France and she's going to get her $1,000,000, or 1,000,000 francs. And she goes back, and it's the worst thing she could have done. She is arrested on February 10th, 1917. At first, she doesn't even get a lawyer because she thinks it's so preposterous. She's like, this is just a misunderstanding. I'm not a spy for the Germans. I've never been. What's going on? But what she doesn't understand is the French are facing a lot of defeat in this war. The Battle of Verdun has gone badly. The Battle of the Somme has gone badly. There are a couple other things that have gone badly, and they need somebody to blame, and they don't want it to be one of their own. So Lido decides he's essentially going to set up Matahari to be somebody who can take the fall for all this nonsense that's gone wrong. Another thing that doesn't work in her favor is the main military interrogator, Pierre Bouchardon, who is going to be essentially holding her fate in his hands, has just experienced his wife cheating on him. So even if he didn't like women who were open with their sexuality before, he especially does not like them now. When he writes his description of her, it's incredibly seething. It says something like feline, supple, artificial, used to gambling, anything and everything, a born spy, along those lines. And this just doesn't align with anything anyone who knows her has said. Everybody else who has met her is like, oh, it was the most enchanting, charming woman I had. He's just the worst person Matahari could have met in this situation because she was so used to relying on men who found her charming that the one time that she needs to run into a guy who finds her charming, brick wall. He hates everything about her. He hates everything she represents. Even more so than Georges Lido, who maybe was just kind of using her. That is not the case for Bouchardon. He is disgusted by her. He can't stand the sight of her. He is very biased against her. All, hallmarks that you want in your investigator. And he does treat her very unfairly. He holds her for months with no evidence in like one of the worst prisons she could have been held in. He intentionally sends her to a prison that she will find depressing because he like gets some kind of like sick thrill out of having like shocked her or whatever, her who was used to living such a lavish lifestyle, and we know Matahari is not, or Margarita Zell was not a stranger to hardship. She had gone through hard times in her life before. This was definitely a new low for her. She was arrested in February. It's now April. And mysteriously, Ludo comes up with some telegrams that are supposed to implicate her about Major Call being like, oh, yes, Matahari is H-21. She is a spy. And that's like the entire content of these telegrams. And they are also sent in the broken code that the Germans have been knowing has been broken. So it is very suspicious. Like, why are the Germans suddenly sending these hyper specific to Matahari text messages or telegrams in broken code? One might conclude that Ludo himself has manufactured them in order to kind of like give the case an extra boost. So Matahari hears all this and she's going through a series of interrogations and then being ignored in complete silence. Her letters are being ignored, her letters aren't being sent outside of the prison. She's being interrogated and she makes the mistake of bringing up the 20,000 francs in one of these interrogations, and they jump on that. They're saying, what do you mean you took 20,000 francs from the German consul? Because that is an incredibly damning thing to do. Why would you take 20,000 francs if you weren't planning to do anything for them? Isn't that immoral? She doesn't think it's immoral because in her head, the Germans owed her because they took her furs. As we know, they took her furs. They were worth more than the 20,000 francs. So she was totally in the clear to take this money with no intention of ever spying for them. And this sounds absolutely ridiculous in an interrogation room, especially with a man who's intent on finding you guilty. So the telegrams and this money together end up being two like critical pieces of evidence they use against her. The third thing that they will throw in there that is incredibly frustrating is she receives 5,000 francs from the Dutch consulate. This is sent to her by her longtime lover in The Hague, the guy who put her up in the house for so long. And, they could have just called and confirmed it, but they didn't. Instead, they were like, this is evidence that the Germans are paying you through the neutral country of Holland, ignoring the fact that she is Dutch and, of course, could be receiving money from somebody in the Netherlands. No. So those three pieces of evidence are the main things that haunt her going into her trial, which go into trial she does. It's July 24th by the time she goes into trial, and July 20th, she's finally moved out of that horrible prison into a slightly better one to be closer to where the trial is taking place. But, really her whole life is falling apart at this point. They get testimony from Vadim, and he pretty much downplays their relationship. One thing that he does do, to his credit, is he insists that she never broached any military subjects with, but he defends her in that way, but does not defend his love for her or the relationship, which must have been devastating to her. There's a couple other of her old lovers who kind of similarly say she never spoke to them about military secrets, but the vast majority kind of turn their back on her. But anyway, July 24th, the trial begins. They're trying to blame her for the death of 50,000 Frenchmen. Can they explain how this happened? No. They can't explain a single state secret that she gave away. They have some circumstantial evidence that she might have been recruited as a spy, but there's no evidence of her having done anything as a spy. And there's definitely no logical chain that links her to the 50,000 deaths. But, at this time it's important to note that the French are really angry and they're really suffering. They lost a lot of people in World War One. It has been a bloody, difficult, unsuccessful war. World War One, they were fighting with weaponry that they had never been used in combat before. So even people who are not dying are coming back with these like terrible injuries and these terrible experiences. And they see this woman who, to be fair, is kind of pretty privileged and detached from a lot of what's going on. I mean, not privileged to be in jail, but she doesn't really care about the war at all. And she has this notoriety about her and this kind of forward thinkingness that's not necessarily appreciated in times of trouble. So, despite the very flimsy evidence, I think one of the prosecutors, after the fact, of course, after the fact, thank you, sir, but after the fact says something like there wasn't enough evidence to flog a cat. And yet they find enough evidence to find her guilty on like all counts. So yeah, then she's sentenced, and we end up kind of back where we began. I think when I got into this, I don't know if I necessarily found the story that I expected to find. I don't know what I expected to find. I think I definitely expected her to do more spying. I One thing I found kind of tragic is she's portrayed at having betrayed the country of France to the death of 50,000 Frenchmen and all of this, but when push came to shove and you look at the facts of the case, it seems far more likely and apparent that instead she was really betrayed, kind of chronically. Her dad never accepted her back into the house when, the family split up, where she could have avoided the situation at the Leyden school. Obviously, her husband betrayed her by giving her syphilis and cheating on her. And in this last unfolding of events, there's several lovers of hers that betray her. There's the Jean Halois guy who sent her to Ladeau in the first place. And there was the colonel who was infatuated with her when they were in Spain. But the second that he landed in France and realized that trouble was afoot, he just kind of scurries away and doesn't seem to do anything to her favor or provide testimony that she wasn't doing anything nefarious in Spain. Who else betrayed her? Ladeau betrays her. Some accounts describe them as having been lovers. It's known that she visited his office a fair amount. It's unclear if it was to just get her permit or if something else was going on there. But he definitely betrayed her as like a spy boss. Spy master, I think is the word. Oh, and Vadim. Vadim also betrayed her in the end. So, yeah, I thought that that was, the core of the tragedy, that she had put her faith in all those people and put her confidence in who she must have been to these people. And really, it didn't pay off for her when it mattered the most. But that being said, her confidence in her image and her ability to sell her image was compounded with the notoriety of the case, and her persona has like far outlasted that of any of the people who kind of set up her downfall. I don't know if Margaretha Zell would have loved every single aspect of the Matahari that has made it into, the public consciousness. I don't know that she definitely didn't see herself as a femme fatale, but she did see herself as glamorous, and that is something that carries over into modern adaptations of the story and such. But then, it's also a possibility that despite how crappy the evidence was at her trial, she was a nefarious German spy who had been spying since she took the 20,000 francs and was just so good at selling an image of this kind of airheaded, fantastical woman that even I fell for it. So, who knows? Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Definitely like and subscribe if you want to. This is a brand new channel, so I would very much appreciate it. And yeah.